facts. This is just one federal judge. We have appealed it very aggressively. We're going to be as aggressive as we can, because not only do we know that the law is on our side, but history is also on our side.
But why did you say 22 previous occasions that the law wasn't on your side, Mr. President? At any rate, that is our president back last month during an immigration town hall co-hosted by MSNBC and Telemundo. As we continue on America's Forum, it is worth noting the White House renewing its effort to try and rescue the president's executive amnesty plan from legal trouble. The Justice Department with an emergency motion asking the Court of Appeals to overrule the decision blocking the immigration plan. The Fifth Circuit said, can't do it quickly, got to take your time. This immigration fight is playing out in court, even as our next guest says Latinos should reject the president's plan. Joining us now to talk about it at the anchor desk, Raul Mas, the senior healthcare executive at United HomeCare, who is a community activist, a writer, and an analyst. It is good to have you, Raul.
Thank you, JD. Thank you for having me.
And you wrote an article about this, saying Latinos reject the president's plan. Why?
I did. I absolutely wanted to warn the Hispanic population that they shouldn't hitch their wagon to the star, quite frankly. And sure enough, as things have turned out, that was exactly the right thing to say. I mean, in my view, quite frankly, as someone who grew up in this country, who understands how our system operates and how understands how you have co-equal branches of government, you simply cannot have a situation where the President of the United States takes it upon himself to decide which immigration laws he's going to enforce and which ones he's not going to enforce. It's remarkable that opening segment that you mentioned, where he basically says that history is on our side and I have the right to do this. Well, for the longest time before he made his executive action, he said absolutely the opposite. This is a gentleman who supposedly is trained in constitutional law. And I, quite frankly, felt that it was an abuse of his executive power. And the reason I wrote that article was to basically warn the Hispanic population, A, this is not how things are done in this country, and B, if you hitch your star to Obama's, or hitch your wagon to Obama's star, you're going to be sadly disappointed, and that's exactly what's happened.
Let me see if there's a distinction, because a lot of people have talked about, hey, the president is doing this unconstitutionally. But you take a look at some figures within the Republican establishment. The former Florida governor, Jeb Bush, just last Friday came out in favor of the Gang of Eight bill on what is amnesty as well. Where do you stand on that whole notion of amnesty for illegals?
Well, listen, I don't know if we can, as a country, quite frankly, deport the millions of people that are here. I don't think it's in the American nature to be separating families and deporting millions of people. However, this is above all a country of laws, okay? And I think that those people who in fact violated the law need to make amends, and they need to come to terms with the fact that they are in fact here illegally, as much as they might hate the term, okay? They crossed into this border in contradiction of U.S. law, and they basically need to go to the back of the line, and they need to undergo a process through which, you know, we can vet them to begin with, and figure out a way as to, you know, how we can incorporate them as fully functioning members of society. But I think the number one priority before any of this takes place, we need to lock down our borders. I mean, we absolutely need to seal the southern border, and quite frankly, I think we need to be paying more attention to our northern border. I am very concerned about the security issue. I lost 2 friends in the World Trade Center. I love this country, you know, and I am just very concerned that there's some things going on south of the border, and also some possible infiltration coming in from Canada from elements that, quite frankly, would want to do harm for this country. I truly believe that, and I think we need to do that first and foremost.
Let's switch gears now and talk about Cuba. We've got about 3.5 minutes left. The whole notion of restoring diplomatic relations, the president, again, with an initiative that a whole lot of people in Congress aren't happy with. It's moving forward. The Castros are still running Cuba. Is that a good thing to move forward with diplomatic?
Not. Huge mistake on the part of the president. You know, I think a great many members of the Cuban American community, as well as Cubans on the island, the dissidents on the island, are actually very taken aback by what they see is capitulation, quite frankly, on the part of this president in front of the Castro brothers, in order, for whatever reason, to leave his legacy as having opened up Cuba, whatever. But it was not a good deal. I mean, there was absolutely no reason to strike this deal at this time. Cuba is basically on its heels right now in terms of the regime, under enormous economic pressure. A lot of their subsidy for oil comes from Venezuela, which, as you know, is also under an enormous amount of pressure, the way oil prices have fallen. And this was a regime from which we could have obtained a lot more concessions than we did. But the president chose not to. And it's been terribly disappointing for Cuban Americans here in the United States. And I think it's been very disappointing for the dissidents on the island that basically he folded way too quickly.
2 minutes remain in our time together, Raul.
Sure.
I'm interested in your take. A lot of speculation that the president will do anything to have Raul Castro show up in the Rose Garden. And of course, the Cubans presented some demands that were even beyond what it appeared the president was interested in.
That would be a sad day in America, JD. I'll tell you why. Because Raul Castro is a cold-blooded killer. I mean, you don't need to listen to me. You can talk to somebody like Brian Littell, who's written several books on the subject of Raul Castro. Brian Littell was the CIA's man in order to sort of track the Castro brothers and understand their psychology. And he has written very clearly that both Fidel Castro and Raul Castro in particular were cold-blooded killers. To think that we now have a president that is basically opening the door to a regime that has been completely in disagreement with the United States and practically at war for many years is really remarkable. I mean, I am not against an opening towards Cuba, but now is not the moment to do it. Fidel and Raul are in their 80s. They're going to die sometime soon. There's no rush for us to do this right now.
But by doing this, with about 30 seconds remaining, Raul, does it allow the Castros to remain
Absolutely.
and
It
the
prolongs
future
them in power.
generations?
It prolongs them in power, and it makes it much more difficult to bring the kind of change to Cuba that I think all of us want to see, which is one of a democracy, which is one where human rights are respected, where there's freedom of press. That doesn't exist right now. We've basically told the Castros, we're not going to sanction you anymore. And that has basically extended their lifespan for probably another 5 or 10 years.
Raul Mas, unfortunately, the time span for this
Quite all right.
interview has gone away, but I do hope you'll
Thank you,
come
sir.
back and visit
I
again
hope so,
real
too.
soon.
Thank you.
Good to have Raul with us. And coming up, what is this about losing sleep and gaining weight? We'll talk about it with Dr. Mitchell Gaynor. Right now, we've got this Newsmax Now update.